Hello, this is the mini lecture for Module 4, Psychology of Climate Change for the Sci 333E Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change course at the University of Maine at Augusta for fall 2017. So this module, we are going to be talking about the actual field, the psychology of climate change. We have been talking kind of around these issues, getting into the human dimensions of climate change, why exactly people should be considering climate change, why we should be considering people when we consider climate change, and all of the topics overlapping with disaster, but then also some of the other connections that we have as a human species outside of disaster when we're talking about climate change. Now here we're going to bring into it the actual psychological processes. Now psychology is going to include, of course, all of the different things within our psyche. This is not just our emotional response to things, but also our cognitions, the way that we think about things, understand things, the way we make decisions, the way we plan, the way we understand concepts like time and scale and scope, and the way that we make connections between things or don't make connections between things. Now, the field, the psychology of climate change, is a relatively new field. We are in the process of co-creating that field currently. And so I wanted to give you the number one big introduction into the field, which would be our first reading, which is the Swim et al. Psychology of Global Climate Change, Addressing a Multifaceted Phenomenon and Set of Challenges. This is a report by the APA's Task Force on the Interface Between Psychology and Global Climate Change. The first version draft of this report was released in 2009. It was open for comments and edits, and then finalized for the 2010 report that I have uploaded onto our Blackboard at this time. It is a fantastic report. I am a big fan of it. And actually, when I was first coming into this field, while I was still in graduate school, and was preparing to start working on my dissertation on the cultural impacts of climate change in Tuvalu, a country that is being threatened by sea level rise, was when this report was first coming out, that first draft report. And so what we have here is basically this understanding by a great number of psychologists who are working on a lot of different issues that overlap with climate change, saying, hey, what do we know so far? How can the field of psychology contribute to the study and research of climate change? Basically, what do we do next? How can we support this? What is our role that we have within it? The book itself is broken up into 5 main sections. Well, first, of course, we have the introduction. Please read the introduction because it gives you a good overview of what exactly it is we're talking about when we say something like the psychology of climate change. Section 1 then starts talking about the different ways in which psychology intersects with climate change. Section 1 would be, how do people understand the risks imposed by climate change? And so again, all of these cognitions that we have, what does it mean to be at risk? And then how do we think about risk in terms of something so big and often specific as well as climate change? Section 2 then moves on to what are the human behavioral contributions to climate change and the psychological and contextual drivers of these contributions. And so basically what this means is, as we have already been talking about, there are a lot of overlaps between humans and climate change. There are a lot of things that we are doing as individuals, but also as a species that created and are now perpetuating climate changes to our natural and environmental systems. Why are we doing this if it is causing climate change and that is bad? And that's actually a legitimate question. This isn't just, well, why would you do this? I really mean, and psychologists mean, well, why? Why are we doing this? What are the motivations? What are the drivers behind the actions that we are making? Why are we right now in this interaction using electricity when our electricity is largely run by fossil fuels that are perpetuating climate change? Why do I drive cars? Why do we go on planes? Why are we eating food out of an industrial agricultural system that is releasing all sorts of greenhouse gases and simultaneously destroying carbon sinks like the forests in order to raise cattle instead of storing carbon in forests so that it's not out in the atmosphere? These are actually really good and legitimate questions. We need to understand what are our motivations as individuals, but then also what are our motivations as a society. By understanding these motivations, then we can start looking at actual behavioral change. If you just say to someone, stop doing that, and don't give them any reason or a good alternative, chances are they're going to keep doing whatever it was that they're doing. Same, especially for these very large system-level actions and behaviors. The third section is what are the psychosocial impacts of climate change? And this is going to get into all of those human society interactions that we have. So we're starting to look at, okay, well, what are the mental health things? What are the, not just individual mental health, but then also community level well-being pieces within climate change. This would include some communities being much more vulnerable to climate change than other communities. This would also include our different cognitions. Why would some communities be much more supportive on a whole community level of climate change actions, adaptations, and mitigations than other communities who are just going to shun this? This is when you have an entire group of people who are in agreement that we should do something or shouldn't do something. What causes that? When communities are impacted by disasters or are looking at that long-term climate change, 50 to 100 years, there's going to be sea level rise implications. How do I consider this in terms of what my community can look forward to, and how do we as a community continue to interact with each other knowing that there's kind of a ticking time clock going? The fourth section is how do people adapt to and cope with the perceived threat and the unfolding impacts of climate change. This has been one of my areas of research in my work in Tuvalu and my work in the South Pacific in general, but then also some of the work that I'm doing in Maine is what does it mean to be in places where we're experiencing small as well as large-scale impacts of climate change, all the way from countries like Tuvalu, which are threatened in 50 to 100 years, the country's not going to be inhabitable anymore because of sea level rise, to here in Maine, we're seeing increased levels of mosquitoes and deer ticks and things like that because of the shifts in our warming. This is not a small impact, but it's a slow impact, and it's so broad and non-specific that we may not necessarily consider it with climate change, but yet we are seeing this and dozens or hundreds of other things simultaneously slowly changing within our lives. What does that mean for us to know that we have this uncertainty? What does it mean for coastal communities who are under much greater threat of hurricanes and disasters? We look at the number of hurricanes that we have had this year, really large-scale, horrible storms, and the drastic, devastating impacts that they have had on communities all along coasts and on islands. And what does it mean to live there, even when the hurricane hasn't hit, just to know that one could? What does it mean to be looking at these other storms that are happening, thinking this could be me and this could be me anytime? What does it mean to be living in a community that just suffered a hurricane and know that there's another one on its way, and you haven't rebuilt or even taken the first preliminary steps toward recovery yet from that first one? There's going to be a high level of ambient threat in communities like this, much less when you're starting to look at communities that may not exist in another couple of generations due to the changes in the climate. These impacts are not just our individual experience of what does this mean to me within my life, but are also our cultural and social identity, who we are as a community, who we are as a family, who we are as a people, as an entire nation. What does it mean to know that we as a nation might not be a nation in a couple of generations. We who have been practicing this culture, who have been living here, who our ancestors are buried here, and here might not exist anymore in just a couple of generations. What does that mean when I look to the future for my kids and for my grandkids? These are really huge questions. Then we have the psychological barriers that limit climate change action. This is going to include some of the political barriers. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. It'll also be, just the basics of how humans work. When you start thinking about, how do we make changes even within our own lives? Think of a bad habit that you have that you've been trying to overcome for a period of time, or think of a good habit that you would like to have that you've been trying to get started for a period of time. How's that going for you? Sometimes it's not that hard to get things started or to stop doing things that we know we shouldn't, but then sometimes you'll have these things that you shouldn't do or you should, but you don't. You can't make that change. What's actually going on within our cognitions, within our thoughts, our emotions, all of the interconnections that we have within our social lives, as well as with our past experiences, our motivations, how do all of these fit together? And that's just for us as individuals. Now consider that you have an entire society of thousands or millions of people, and we have to come to some consensus about what do we do next. How do we make those decisions? How do we come to agreement about it? And then how do we make those decisions turn into action after we have gone through that process of figuring out all of this? And then section 6 covers how can psychologists assist in limiting climate change. So basically looking at how can we support the distribution of knowledge and understanding. How can we support the emotional and the cognitive grasp of something so big as climate change? How can we as psychologists contribute to building communities and building societies that are going to be strong and purposeful and active in very knowledgeable ways about what we need to do as individuals, but then also as communities. And then, of course, when we do have these massive storms that come through, how can we support in the recovery of that? Finally, the book will close with summary and discussion. I would encourage you to look over that, especially it starts getting into some of the future directions that we are now in the future of this book having been written. So we're making research direction steps. We are continuing to figure out what it is that we need to know and how can we move forward with that. We also look into our ethical considerations. Different communities are going to understand climate change very differently, and of course we have, I believe I should say, an ethical obligation to favor the needs of vulnerable communities when we're looking at any sort of adaptation, mitigation, or action regarding climate change. Some people have more power than others, and those of us who have more power, we as Americans, for example, have a great deal of power on the global scale. We have an ethical obligation, as I believe it, in order to do right by the rest of the world, particularly those areas that are being impacted very strongly and very powerfully by climate change that in large part we have created. Now, that kind of gives an overview about what you will find in the book, but then I also want to talk about some of the issues that we see within the psychology of climate change. There have been, like I said, it's a new and emerging field, and since this book was first released, there's been a great deal of action amongst psychologists in many of the different divisions of the American Psychological Association. Now, each division kind of covers a different field of study within psychology. I am in divisions that cover policy, that cover environmental psychology, that cover community psychology, that look at a lot of different different things, social justice, for example. There's been an interdivisional task force that has been working on how do we research and how do we understand what are the mental models of climate change by which people are working, in which we are trying to figure out basically what to do next. And within this, it can be an awful lot of things. So I have colleagues who are working with teenagers and trying to develop their ecological identity. So basically understanding who they are within social ecologies, but then also within environmental ecologies, the power that they have in order to influence the world around us. And that means understanding how our actions have consequences in both good and bad ways, meaning like what can we actively do in order to promote climate sustainability? What can we do in order to promote community sustainability? I also have been doing research, like I said, on the impacts of climate change. I've done research on looking at the social connections between climate change professionals, how they professionally and socially connect with each other, share information, learn from each other, especially across very large, spatially diverse and professionally diverse regions. I've said before, and I like to say this often, one of the places where I derive a great deal of hope when I'm feeling hopeless about the scope of climate change is the fact that I personally know thousands of people, have met thousands of people who are actively working in climate change. One of the places where I met like 1,000 people was by doing a network analysis research where I was looking at the professional and social connections of climate change professionals in the Pacific Island region. Now this was in a dozen different countries, people who spoke different language, who lived in an area that covers a third of the globe. And our climate change researchers, our professionals would include meteorologists and climatologists and social scientists like myself. But it also included a dive shop owner who worked in Palau, and just the very fact of him working with the environment in the tourist industry in his country had led him to become very active within climate change and within his community. And so we see things like this as well. You don't have to have a title like mine in order to be a climate change professional. And so again, I'm going to say, welcome. You're now in this field. You are now co-creating this knowledge. Whatever you do with your life, you get to carry this forward and apply it. So that's going to be pretty great. We always need more great people like you. Our other reading is Knowledge, A Very Brief Introduction by Jennifer Nagel. This is kind of a strange book for this class, but I'm going to tell you why I chose it. Our academic theme for this year at the University of Maine at Augusta is truth, and so we're looking at how people understand truth. Within the field, this is, by the way, the book that goes along with our academic theme, so it's being used in a number of classes. Truth within climate change is a very weird and nebulous thing, because the way that we understand things, our cognitions, are going to direct a great deal of our behaviors and our actions and our motivations. It's also going to influence what information we take to be true and what information we say, nope, that's BS, I do not believe that to be true. So our past experiences, our psychological cognitions that we have are going to influence when we receive new information, the extent to which we believe it or disbelieve it. We have motivated reasoning. There's an entire field of psychology within this motivated reasoning. And so I'm very interested, and one of the things that I'm starting to study now is when do people engage with information about climate change? When do people not engage? When do people believe things that are not true? When do people call BS on things that are true? So within the field of climate change, there's a lot of information that is out there by climate scientists, advocates, activists, politicians, all sorts. There's a lot of information that's available. And in fact, people who are engaged in climate change sciences writ large have often been called on to speak very publicly about their science in ways that we haven't really expected scientists to be engaged with the public in the past. Now, as a fun little side story, I know a lot of scientists who went into science because they wanted to do science. They didn't want to do public relations. And now they have to talk with people and argue with people about their science and about their field in ways that they never expected that they would have to. And so it's kind of this, I went into science so I didn't have to talk with people, and now they do. The other side of that, of course, is that there are industries that are vested in us and not coming to any sort of agreement about climate change action. So, for example, oil industries, even banking industries, and things that make a lot of money off of the social status quo that we have, don't want us to stop using oil, don't want us to change our economies because it will cause a loss of profits. It's been very well documented for the past 30, 40 years. ExxonMobil, other, BP and other oil companies and many others have actively put false information out into the public to make it seem as though the debate about climate change is ongoing. This actually seems that there is still a debate about whether or not climate change is happening seems plausible for most people in the public who are not scientists. And one of the reasons for this is because scientists often deal with uncertainty. And scientific uncertainty doesn't mean I don't know whether or not this is going to happen. Scientific uncertainty is instead, I don't know exactly the extent to which this is going to happen and on what timeline it's going to happen, because those things are in the future. I can say, for example, with 95% certainty that there is going to be, this type of climate change over the next 100 years, but when exactly that's going to happen, if it's going to be in 25 years because we've had a really bad storm year, if it's going to be closer to 100 years because people are really getting on the ball, I can't say that. And as we talked about with the IPCC reports in the last module, not being able to predict what humans are going to do is one of the big uncertainties that scientists have when they are creating these models. And so scientists don't want to say this is happening because human society might come together and create another alternative. We might create another reality on into the future that doesn't align with the models. And so that's where the uncertainty lies, is not whether or not, but when exactly and how bad exactly. However, when scientists get up and say, well, there's still a great deal of uncertainty, what we hear out in the real world where we regularly talk about uncertainty is I don't know, is we hear I don't know. And so that makes it very plausible for why people would believe misinformation that's out there, why it seems plausible. If you have experts who are saying, well, we believe that this is true, but there's also still this uncertainty, and then you have people actively spreading misinformation saying, see, they don't even know what they're talking about, and I have evidence that proves X, Y, Z, people are going to buy that because the confidence within it. Now, this brings us back to this book, is that this isn't actually a psychology book, this is a philosophy book, but it looks at the ways in which humans understand and interact with knowledge. How do we think about information that we know, that we believe, that we feel is true, that we think we know but actually is false information? How do we interact with all of these things? What are our conceptions about knowledge? What are we skeptical about? What are our standards for evidence if it's something that seems true to us versus something that doesn't seem true to us? And our standards of evidence are very greatly different based on different contexts within our lives. This brings us back into psychology. If I have a motivation to believe what you are saying, you don't have to back up what you're saying. I will believe you. If I have a motivation to disbelieve what you are saying, you're going to have to back up what you're saying a great deal in order for me to believe you. And even then, I might not fully believe you or believe you at all. And so all of these different things play into the ways in which we interact with knowledge. This is a fascinating and fun read, so I would encourage you to look through it. Spend as much or as little time as you want. I have a couple of questions, look at one of the one of the chapters. With the Swim et al. Book, I would like you to read the entire book because it is the psychology of climate change. It's the consensus of information that we had at that time so far, and that we are continuing to build on from there. Now, the assignments for this week, for the reading reflection for 75% of this module's grades, I want you to describe the 5 major intersections between psychology and climate change. This is basically the sections 1 through 5, those different questions that I talked through at the beginning of this video. Describe them. Don't just write down the questions. I want you to say, from your perspective, from your understanding of reading this book, what goes into each of those pieces, what is important for us to consider as psychologists, these major intersections between psychology and climate change. And then for each of these major intersections that you talk about, I want to know what is interesting to you, basically. So what strikes you as non-obvious, where you were reading it and thought, I wouldn't have ever thought of that before. So what's something that you haven't thought of, or that you think most people wouldn't have thought of, even if it's something that you have thought of? And then I want you to grab at least one chapter from Nagel, and I want you to think about, like, how does the way that people understand knowledge, how might that influence what people know about climate change? And then I want you to consider, for the 4th question, different ways in which people learn about climate change, for example, from personal experience, from education, television, internet, etc. What are some strengths and limits to what individuals might know about climate change based on their sources of information? Because, of course, reading something on Facebook, reading or hearing something from your best friend, or reading, extensive research about it, are going to lead you to very different perspectives and understanding. So what are some strengths and limitations to those things? For applying the terminology to a real-life scenario, I want you to find an opinion piece about climate change from this year. It can be in print or on video, but I want you to think about the author's perspective, not your own perspective, not what you are learning from this opinion piece. I want you to try to understand what information or what point of view that author is trying to sell you. What does the author think? What is their opinion? What does the author know? What are the facts that they give or provide or reference within this opinion piece? And what are the psychological considerations, considering back to the book and also considering Nagel, that may influence what the author thinks or knows. And so again, this is going to be a little bit philosophical, but I'm asking you to look into the cognitions of someone else based on what they have written. This will also be very interesting to those of you who are already working on your own statement for the Raising the Bar project, and or who are actively engaged with the group Raising the Bar project. This is the sort of thing that we need to consider as we're expressing our opinions, is how are other people going to be reading those expressions. Now, this module is going to be due on November 5th at midnight. As always, let me know if you have any questions.